Psychologists have long studied how environmental changes alter human behavior, but nothing triggers bizarre entitlement quite like a cruise ship. Put perfectly rational adults on a megaship, and suddenly they are fighting over trivia answers and smuggling buffet pizza. These 12 documented incidents explore the hilarious, terrifying reality of nautical marital disputes. 1. Let's ask you a question. Have you ever considered exactly how much heavy lifting smartphones do in a modern marriage? Frank and Eleanor, a couple in their late 50s from Chicago, decided that their 10-night Mediterranean cruise would be a complete digital detox. Frank's grand idea was to lock both of their phones in the cabin safe on embarkation day and not look at them until they returned to port. He claimed it would force them to look into each other's eyes and rediscover the spark they had in 1992. The problem with rediscovering the spark is that you sometimes realize the pilot light went out for a very good reason. For the first 24 hours, the digital detox was incredibly peaceful. But on the second evening, while dining at the steakhouse, a mild debate broke out over the name of the actor who played the villain in a moderately successful 90s action movie. Frank said it was John Malkovich. Eleanor insisted it was Gary Oldman. Normally, this is a 3-second internet search that ends in a mild grunt of acknowledgement. Without the internet, it became a festering psychological infection. By day 3, normal conversation had completely died, replaced by a simmering hostility centered entirely around this trivial piece of pop culture. Frank refused to concede, attempting to prove his point by poorly acting out scenes from the movie over his morning oatmeal, which only made Eleanor more furious. She began aggressively cornering the ship's crew, asking 20-something waiters from Eastern Europe if they remembered a specific helicopter explosion from a film released before they were born. The tension reached its absolute peak on day 5 when Eleanor finally cracked. While Frank was taking a shower, she quietly approached the cabin safe to retrieve her phone and end the madness. But Frank, anticipating her weakness, had secretly changed the safe's passcode. When Eleanor confronted him, dripping wet in a bathrobe, Frank smugly tapped his temple and said she wasn't getting the code until she admitted Malkovich was the guy who hijacked the plane. Eleanor didn't yell. She calmly opened her suitcase, packed all of her belongings, marched down to the purser's desk, and demanded a separate cabin, citing irreconcilable cinematic differences. They spent the remaining 5 days completely avoiding each other. On the morning of disembarkation, Eleanor stood at the gangway holding a piece of paper she had printed at the ship's internet cafe. It was a screenshot of the movie's cast list. It wasn't Malkovich or Oldman. It was Nicolas Cage. She calmly pressed the piece of paper flat against his chest with her hand, silently turned her back to him, and took a separate taxi to the airport. 2. Dennis, a retired accountant, agreed to a Caribbean getaway on the condition it would be relaxing. His wife, Patricia, however, viewed the trip as a competitive photo opportunity. She packed 12 sets of perfectly coordinated couples outfits for a 6-night sailing. We aren't talking about subtle color matching here. We are talking about identical, custom-printed polyester ensembles. Day 1 was matching flamingo tracksuits. Day 2 was neon yellow polo shirts featuring their own dog's face printed on the back. Dennis endured this sartorial hostage situation with the grim stoicism of a man who just wanted to eat his buffet eggs in peace. The breaking point arrived on formal night when Patricia unveiled her masterpiece. A custom-tailored tuxedo for Dennis constructed from the exact same shimmering, aggressively purple floral fabric as her evening gown. He looked less like a husband and more like a walking, deeply unhappy set of theater curtains. Dennis stared at the purple monstrosity, silently walked over to his suitcase, and pulled out an aggressively faded pair of gray sweatpants. When Patricia shrieked that he couldn't enter the main dining room looking like a gym teacher from 1996, Dennis simply nodded. He marched straight to the casual pizza counter on Deck 9 in his sweatpants, sat alone, and spent the entire evening eating pepperoni slices. He completely refused to change clothes for the remaining 2 days of the cruise, resulting in disembarkation photos where Patricia looked like a glamorous socialite, and Dennis looked like a random drifter who had wandered onto the ship to steal a free breakfast. 3. Picture a couple in their early 30s, Kevin and Sarah, who made the catastrophic decision to begin a strict, no-carbohydrate diet on the exact same day they boarded a luxury cruise ship known for its award-winning pastry chefs. Sarah was armed with militant discipline, while Kevin possessed the willpower of a golden retriever in a butcher shop. For 2 days, Kevin loudly complained about the dining room menu, dramatically pushing grilled chicken around his plate while staring mournfully at the next table's breadbasket. Sarah praised his commitment, completely unaware that Kevin was running a covert carbohydrate smuggling operation. The illusion shattered on night 3. Sarah woke up at 2 in the morning, noticed her husband was missing, and went looking for him. She didn't find him at the casino or the late-night bar. She found him sitting in a dimly lit corner of the midnight buffet, wearing his pajama pants and one slipper. Kevin was rapidly consuming a massive plate stacked with 6 slices of supreme pizza, garlic bread, and 2 chocolate eclairs, eating with the panicked speed of a feral raccoon that knows the porch light just turned on. He was so focused he didn't notice Sarah standing directly behind him. She watched him shove an entire eclair into his mouth, leaned in close to his ear, whispered that she hoped the gluten was worth it, and walked away. She returned to the cabin and engaged the manual deadbolt, forcing a garlic-scented Kevin to sleep on a damp lounger near the children's splash pad until the sun came up. 4. Let's ponder the exact moment a well-intentioned surprise transforms into an inescapable nautical prison. Emily booked a 10-night luxury European cruise for her husband Greg's 40th birthday. Greg had one explicit, non-negotiable request for this milestone vacation: absolutely 0 family members. He wanted 10 days of uninterrupted silence and premium cocktails, far away from his notoriously overbearing, highly critical parents. Emily, possessing a fatal misunderstanding of deep-rooted family dynamics, decided that Greg didn't actually mean what he said. She secretly booked his parents into the balcony cabin directly next door as the ultimate birthday surprise. When Greg opened his cabin door on embarkation day and saw his mother standing there holding a foil balloon, his soul briefly left his body. The situation immediately deteriorated from a mild annoyance into a full-scale hostage crisis. Greg's mother demanded the exterior balcony divider be opened permanently so they could have a shared outdoor living space. She started casually walking into their room at 7 in the morning in her bathrobe to critique Greg's room service breakfast choices, pointing out that scrambled eggs were bad for his cholesterol. Greg spent the first 3 days hiding in the ship's casino, a place his mother deemed morally corrupt, just to avoid her constant hovering. The tension finally shattered on day 4. Greg had reached his absolute limit. While his wife and parents were attending a napkin-folding seminar, Greg secretly marched down to the guest services desk. He aggressively swiped his personal credit card and paid $4,000 out of pocket to upgrade his parents to a massive suite located on the absolute opposite end of the 15-deck megaship. He even requested that their keycards be blocked from accessing his specific hallway. Greg returned to his cabin, poured 2 glasses of expensive champagne, and waited for Emily. When she arrived, he proudly announced the good news. He had relocated the warden, and they were finally going to enjoy the rest of the cruise alone. Now, this is where the grand gesture spectacularly implodes. Emily didn't smile. She dropped her purse, burst into hysterical tears, and revealed a devastating financial secret. Emily didn't actually pay for the birthday cruise. Greg's parents had paid for the entire vacation, including Greg and Emily's premium drink packages and specialty dining, as a generous gift. Emily had just taken the credit to look like an amazing wife. By forcibly evicting his parents to the other side of the ship, Greg had just profoundly insulted the exact people who were currently funding his luxurious lifestyle. When the parents found out they had been aggressively banished by their own son, they didn't get mad. They got incredibly petty. The father marched to the purser's desk and systematically canceled every single perk attached to Greg and Emily's reservation. He revoked their deluxe beverage packages, canceled their expensive shore excursions in Greece, and deleted their reservations at the onboard steakhouse. He left them with nothing but basic tap water and access to the buffet. Emily was so furious at Greg for ruining her meticulously planned lie that she packed her bags, walked to the other side of the ship, and moved into the luxury suite with her in-laws, citing the fact that the suite had a free espresso machine and a personal butler. Greg spent the remaining 6 days of his milestone birthday completely alone in his original cabin, drinking complimentary lukewarm water, eating dry toast at the buffet, and actively hiding behind decorative pillars whenever he saw his family walking toward him on the promenade. 5. Let me ask you, have you ever witnessed a man's dignity physically evaporate in real time? Brenda treated the ship's upper pool deck not as a vacation space, but as a tactical military zone. On day 3 of a Caribbean sailing, she woke her husband, Tom, at 5:15 in the morning, handed him 4 oversized plastic flamingo towel clips, and ordered him to secure premium loungers by the main pool. Tom, wearing a bathrobe and 1 sock, stumbled into the darkness and found 4 perfect chairs. For the next 5 hours, he sat on a damp plastic mesh lounger in the cold morning air, aggressively defending the empty chairs from roaming packs of early-rising European pensioners. He skipped breakfast. He skipped his morning coffee. He simply sat there, shivering, holding the line like a loyal soldier. At 10:45, the sun was finally blazing, the pool deck was packed, and Brenda casually strolled out of the elevators holding a mimosa. She looked at the crowded pool, looked at the perfectly secured chairs Tom had defended with his life, and casually sighed, noting that it was a bit too noisy out here, and she would rather just sit in the quiet, indoor solarium instead. Tom didn't yell. He didn't even change his facial expression. He slowly unclipped the 4 plastic flamingos, handed them to a very confused German tourist standing nearby, picked up his towel, and checked himself into the casino. He spent the remainder of the 4-day cruise sleeping on a sofa in the cigar lounge, communicating with his wife exclusively by sliding losing blackjack receipts under their cabin door. 6. Derek, a corporate auditor from Boston, took the ship's daily progressive trivia so seriously you would think the grand prize was a controlling stake in the cruise line. It wasn't. The prize was a cheap canvas tote bag and a plastic gold medal, but Derek competed with the ruthless intensity of a man defending a doctoral thesis. His wife, Michelle, was just there to enjoy the 2-for-1 margaritas. For 6 days, they were tied for first place with a team of 3 retired sisters from Florida. On the final afternoon in a packed English pub, it all came down to a single tiebreaker question. In what exact year was the original Tamagotchi digital pet released? Michelle's eyes instantly lit up. She whispered 1996 because she had aggressively collected them in high school. Derek snorted dismissively. He leaned in and delivered a condescending, highly confident lecture about how Japanese electronic exports didn't penetrate Western retail markets until late 1997. He took his heavy black pen, aggressively scribbled out Michelle's correct answer, blew the rubber eraser shavings off the paper, and wrote down 1997. When the cruise director happily announced that the correct answer was indeed 1996, Derek froze. He stared at the paper. Michelle stared at the side of his head in absolute, chilling silence while the 3 elderly sisters at the next table cheered and high-fived. Michelle didn't scream or demand an apology. She calmly picked up her half-empty margarita, walked directly over to the winning table, and politely asked the sisters if they were accepting applications for a 4th sibling. She spent the remaining 2 sea days exclusively doing water aerobics and drinking mimosas with the Florida ladies, completely ghosting her husband. Derek spent his final 48 hours of vacation sitting alone in the ship's library, using the incredibly slow, overpriced satellite internet to aggressively dispute the cruise director's answer on Wikipedia. 7. There is a very specific type of torture that occurs when 2 people fundamentally disagree on basic cabin thermodynamics. Colin viewed himself as an amateur meteorologist and an ocean purist. He firmly insisted that their balcony door must remain propped open every single night so he could breathe the authentic, salty sea air. His wife, Rebecca, repeatedly pointed out that modern cruise ships are engineered with an automatic feature where opening the exterior door instantly disables the cabin's air conditioning. Colin dismissed this as a corporate myth and wedged a heavy wooden coat hanger into the sliding door track to keep it open. By 2 in the morning, their room was a stagnant 84 degrees with 90% humidity. The mirrors were completely fogged over. Rebecca lay awake, sweating through her expensive pajamas, while Colin snored peacefully under a single thin sheet. On the 4th night, the ship encountered a severe, fast-moving tropical squall off the coast of Honduras. Sideways rain began blasting through the open gap at 40 miles per hour. Rebecca woke up to the sound of the heavy curtains violently flapping. She opened her eyes and watched a massive puddle of seawater rapidly advancing across the carpet directly toward Colin's open suitcase, which happened to contain his uninsured $3,000 photography equipment. Did she shake him awake? Absolutely not. She quietly rolled out of bed, gathered her own suitcase and her noise-canceling headphones, and moved completely into the bathroom. She locked the door, made a highly comfortable nest out of plush white ship towels in the dry bathtub, and went back to sleep. Colin woke up at 6 in the morning completely soaked, stepping onto a carpet that squished like a wet kitchen sponge, holding a DSLR camera that was actively leaking muddy seawater from the battery compartment. When he banged on the bathroom door demanding to know why she didn't wake him up to save his gear, Rebecca cheerfully replied through the solid wood that she simply didn't want to interrupt his deep spiritual connection with the ocean. 8. We all know that one guy who tries to outsmart a multi-billion-dollar corporation, right? Walter viewed the cruise line's premium beverage package not as an amenity, but as a high-stakes financial battle. Before boarding a European megaship, he created a detailed spreadsheet to ensure he and his wife Pamela would mathematically bankrupt the casino bar. Walter calculated that to beat the house, they each needed to consume exactly 8.5 premium beverages per calendar day. This was a significant problem, as Pamela enjoyed exactly 1 glass of Pinot Grigio with dinner. By day 3, the vacation had devolved into a militaristic hydration camp. Walter was waking Pamela up at 9 in the morning, holding a heavy, spicy Bloody Mary, tapping his wristwatch, and anxiously whispering that they were falling dangerously behind their morning projections. The breaking point occurred during a peaceful afternoon by the adult pool. Pamela was reading a novel when Walter marched over, slapped a massive frozen margarita onto her side table, and aggressively marked a tally on a pocket notepad. He loudly informed her that she needed to finish it in 12 minutes to maximize their hourly value before the martini bar opened. Pamela didn't argue. She carefully placed her bookmark in her novel, picked up the sticky drink, and poured the entire fluorescent pink contents directly over Walter's open leather wallet. She calmly informed him that his financial projections were now officially in the red, and spent the remaining 5 days drinking complimentary tap water at the library, while Walter aggressively consumed 14 cocktails a day purely out of spite. 9. Marcus and Melissa boarded a 15-story American cruise ship with a grand scheme that Marcus had spent 3 months concocting in his basement. Their goal was simple: secure a free, highly coveted upgrade from a standard interior room to a luxury balcony suite. Marcus's master plan, which he aggressively sold to his wife as a foolproof nautical life hack, was to stage a dramatic, irreconcilable marital breakdown on day 2. His logic, derived entirely from a defunct internet message board, was that if a couple faked a hostile, tear-filled separation, guest services would be legally obligated to separate them to avoid a domestic incident. And since the standard cabins were fully booked, one of them would inevitably be placed in whatever ultra-premium suite happened to be empty. It was a terribly flawed plan, built on a profound misunderstanding of maritime hospitality management. But Melissa reluctantly agreed to play her part. The execution began in the ship's grand atrium. Marcus delivered his opening lines with the wooden stiffness of a daytime soap opera actor, loudly declaring to the ceiling that he couldn't spend another minute sharing a bathroom with a woman who had zero respect for his spatial awareness. Melissa, however, possessed an untapped, terrifying theatrical genius. When they finally marched up to the guest services counter to demand separate living quarters, she didn't just shed a few fake tears. She unleashed a deeply personal, remarkably specific monologue. She leaned across the marble counter, clutching her chest, and began listing Marcus's actual, real-life flaws to an incredibly uncomfortable senior purser. She brought up his chronic inability to load a dishwasher correctly, his catastrophic cryptocurrency investments from 3 years ago, and a suspiciously long anecdote about how he ruined her sister's wedding by openly fighting with the caterer over the texture of a shrimp cocktail. Marcus stood there, initially nodding along to sell the bit, until he realized Melissa was no longer acting. The veins in his neck started to bulge. He broke character entirely and defensively snapped back that her sister's wedding was a cheap disaster anyway, and that the shrimp was undeniably rubbery. What started as a fraudulent scheme instantly metamorphosed into a brutally real, completely unhinged couples therapy session in front of a line of 80 confused passengers waiting to dispute their internet packages. They screamed at each other for a full 20 minutes until the ship's chief security officer had to intervene, gently guiding a genuinely sobbing Melissa into a private office while a seething Marcus stood by the elevators, absolutely furious that his fake fight had turned into a legitimate public roasting. Now, here is where Marcus's master plan actually worked, but with a spectacularly vindictive twist. The ship's management, completely convinced by Melissa's Oscar-worthy emotional breakdown, enacted their zero-tolerance domestic dispute protocol. They handed Marcus a new keycard. Marcus puffed out his chest, fully expecting the penthouse. Instead, they handed him the keys to a windowless, 100-square-foot medical overflow cabin located on Deck 2, sandwiched directly between the ship's laundry facility and a mechanical vibration room. When Marcus demanded to know where his wife was being moved, the officer calmly explained that a generous VIP passenger had heard the commotion and volunteered to swap rooms, meaning Melissa was currently being escorted to the two-bedroom owner's suite, complete with a grand piano and a wraparound terrace. Realizing the catastrophic backfire of his own scheme, Marcus panicked, dropped the entire act, and loudly confessed to the security officer that it was all a fake plot to get an upgrade and that he loved his wife dearly. The officer, obligated by protocol, picked up the phone and called the owner's suite to inform Melissa that her husband was claiming the fight was a hoax and wanted to move into the suite with her. Melissa, sitting on a plush velvet sofa in her new palace, took the phone, listened to the explanation, and saw her golden opportunity. She calmly replied that Marcus's erratic behavior was exactly why she needed space, and she formally requested the ship enforce a strict no-contact mandate for her mental well-being. By signing the domestic separation form Marcus himself had initiated, she legally barred him from coming within 50 feet of her for the rest of the 10-day sailing. She hung up the phone, spent the next week living like European royalty, and left Marcus legally trapped in a vibrating metal box, completely unable to do anything about it. 10. I need you to honestly answer this. Who actually goes on a floating luxury buffet to lose weight? If there is one absolute rule of vacationing, it is that a cruise ship is not a gymnasium. Gary brought his brand new smartwatch on a 7-day sailing with an unhinged goal. He didn't just want to track his steps. He wanted to dominate the ship's walking metrics. His wife, Diane, was on vacation exclusively to drink frozen mudslides and read novels. By day 2, Gary instituted a strict no-elevator policy. He forced Diane, wearing wedge heels, to walk up 11 flights of stairs to reach the buffet, lecturing her about cardiovascular health while she hyperventilated near the handrail. The breaking point arrived on formal night. Diane put on a heavy floor-length gown and stilettos. Gary, sweating in his tuxedo, pointed to the stairwell. He loudly declared they needed exactly 800 more steps to hit his daily goal before they were permitted to eat. Diane stared at him, looked at her uncomfortable shoes, and calmly asked him to hand over his watch so she could sync it to her phone. Gary proudly unbuckled the device. Diane didn't sync a thing. She walked over to the cabin's ceiling fan, used a piece of medical tape, and firmly attached the smartwatch to the end of the fan blade. She turned the fan on the highest hurricane setting, locked the cabin door from the outside, and took the elevator down to the steakhouse. She enjoyed a peaceful dinner by herself, while Gary spent 2 hours pacing the hallways, absolutely thrilled that his smartphone app was logging roughly 45,000 steps per hour. 11. Julian, a regional sales manager with the misplaced confidence of a late-night talk show host, dragged his wife Clara onto the stage of the ship's popular couples game show. Clara explicitly begged him beforehand to keep his answers light, cute, and firmly surface level. Julian nodded in agreement, but the moment the stage lights hit his face and 800 passengers applauded, he experienced a catastrophic ego trip. He no longer viewed himself as a husband on a romantic vacation. He believed he was performing a sold-out comedy special. The first few questions were harmless, but then the cruise director, wearing a sparkly silver blazer, asked the husbands to reveal the most ridiculous secret their wife was hiding from their neighbors back home. Most men wrote down safe, predictable things like stealing the neighbor's newspaper or hiding parking tickets. Julian clicked his dry erase marker and enthusiastically went completely rogue. When it was his turn to reveal his board, he didn't just hold it up. He stood up, grabbed the microphone directly from the cruise director's hand, and announced to a completely silent theater that Clara had recently spent $3,000 hiring a fraudulent pet psychic to locate her missing purebred cat, only to find the cat asleep inside their own box spring mattress 2 days later. He even mimicked her crying over the phone to the psychic, exaggerating her voice for comedic effect. The audience didn't laugh. They let out a collective, incredibly uncomfortable gasp. Clara sat frozen in her high stool, her face turning a vibrant, dangerous shade of magenta. The cruise director nervously tried to steer the joke back to safe territory by offering a forced chuckle, but Clara simply stood up. She calmly took the microphone from Julian's sweating hand, looked directly into the camera broadcasting to every single television screen on the mega ship, and smiled sweetly. She informed the entire vessel that Julian wore a specially engineered hairpiece that required industrial-grade glue, and without it, his head resembled a sad, abandoned bird's nest. She then gently dropped the microphone onto the stage floor, walked down the center aisle, and spent the remainder of the cruise wearing oversized sunglasses by the adult pool. Julian was forced to wear a souvenir baseball cap indoors for the next 4 days because passengers kept subtly staring at his hairline in the buffet line, and they communicated exclusively through passive-aggressive grunts for the rest of the voyage. 12. I want you to imagine the sheer panic of realizing you've outsmarted yourself. Let me introduce you to Arthur and Penelope, a couple from Seattle navigating a 12-night Mediterranean itinerary. Penelope wanted to book the cruise line's official, air-conditioned luxury bus tour to the Amalfi Coast. Arthur, a man who treated onboard excursion desks like criminal syndicates, flatly refused. He insisted that true travelers rent their own vehicles to authentically immerse themselves in the local culture. So, while 3,000 other passengers boarded comfortable coaches, Arthur marched his wife to a dusty local rental agency in Naples and secured a 1998 manual transmission Fiat Panda that smelled aggressively of stale cheese and unfiltered cigarettes. There was only one minor problem with this cultural immersion. Arthur hadn't driven a manual car since his college days. The marital deterioration began immediately. It took Arthur 14 stalled attempts just to get out of the port parking lot, with Penelope gripping the plastic dashboard so hard her knuckles turned white. By the time they reached the terrifying winding cliffside roads of the coast, Arthur was sweating profusely through his expensive linen shirt, grinding the gears so violently it sounded like a blender full of silverware. The absolute peak of the crisis occurred in a microscopic medieval village. Arthur took a rogue shortcut down a narrow cobblestone alleyway designed exclusively for donkeys and pedestrian traffic. He completely stalled the car on a 20-degree incline. Every time he tried to release the clutch, the Fiat violently lurched backward toward a stone bakery displaying delicate pastries. A massive line of angry Italian locals on Vespas quickly formed behind them, honking relentlessly and gesturing wildly. Penelope, wearing an elegant floral sundress and strappy sandals, was forced to get out and physically push the rear bumper of the tiny car while Arthur desperately revved the engine. She stood in the blistering midday sun, covered in dark exhaust fumes and road dust, crying quietly as a local butcher yelled helpful driving instructions at her in a language she didn't understand. They eventually abandoned the vehicle entirely, leaving the keys in the ignition, and paid a local farmer €300 to drive them back to Naples in the open bed of a fertilizer truck. They arrived at the port exactly 4 minutes before the all-aboard time. They sprinted up the steep gangway, breathless, traumatized, and completely filthy. Arthur triumphantly slapped his cruise card on the security scanner, boasting to Penelope that his independent travel plan was a complete success. The machine aggressively beeped red. The security officer looked at the card, looked at Arthur's sweat-drenched face, and politely informed him that this vessel was the Grand European Explorer. Arthur and Penelope were actually booked on the Grand European Navigator, which the officer casually pointed out was currently a small white speck on the horizon, having departed 40 minutes prior. They had rushed back to the wrong megaship. Now, you might think the story ends with them stranded in Italy. It does not. The port agent offered them a solution. A private maritime water taxi could speed them to their correct ship, which was waiting in international waters, for a fee of $1,500. Arthur crossed his arms, scoffed at the price, and told the agent he would rather take a cheap public ferry to the next port and meet the ship tomorrow. Penelope stopped breathing. She looked at her husband, who had just forced her to push a car up a mountain and miss their luxury cruise to save $50 on a bus ticket. She calmly took her passport out of his backpack, handed her credit card to the port agent to pay for the speedboat, and explicitly instructed the driver that there was only going to be one passenger. She sped off into the Mediterranean sunset, leaving Arthur standing on the concrete dock next to a garbage can, trying to figure out the local bus schedule. What these stories reveal isn't just that people are petty. It's that the artificial environment of a cruise ship removes our usual social filters. The ship merely accelerates what was already there. So, which of these spouses actually deserved their punishment, and who crossed the line? Tell me below. Subscribe if you want more behavioral deep dives, because the ocean never runs out of crazy.